The snow was falling thick that November evening in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, swallowing the streets in a white silence. Richard Whitmore walked without direction, his leather shoes crunching through slush that seeped into the hems of his tailored trousers. Normally, he would never have been out on a night like this. His chauffeur would drive him to whatever meeting or dinner was on his calendar. But tonight, there was nowhere to go. Nowhere that mattered. The only sound that stayed with him wasn't the hum of traffic or the wind curling under his cashmere coat. It was the voice of Dr. Jonathan Lee, still echoing in his ears. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. Inoperable. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. 8 months, maybe a year. 8 months. A year. The words clung to him like the damp snow on his shoulders. At 52, Richard had built an empire from nothing. Manufacturing plants across the state, real estate holdings, a seat on several prestigious boards. A fortune counted not in millions, but in tens of millions. He had 3 homes, a yacht docked in Florida, a collection of vintage cars stored in a heated garage. But none of it mattered, because when he tried to picture his funeral, he saw plenty of suits, colleagues, business partners, but not a single person who would weep for him out of love. His thoughts slipped backward as he trudged along Queen Street. His father had died suddenly of a heart attack when Richard was 37, his mother 3 years later from a stroke. He hadn't been there for either of them, too busy flying to New York for a merger, too buried in quarterly reports. He had sent money for the funerals, flowers, even a proxy to stand in his place. But not himself. It had seemed excusable at the time. Business couldn't wait. Now the memory burned. He had worked and built and conquered, but in doing so had cut himself off from every bond of family. His chest tightened, not from the tumor, but from the hollowness that expanded with every step. He tilted his head to the sky, letting the snow melt against his cheeks and mingle with tears he made no effort to hide. For the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore wept openly. He had wandered into Buchanan Park without realizing it. The place was nearly deserted, save for a couple of bundled-up dog walkers rushing home. He meant to keep moving, but a sound stopped him. A child's voice, small, weary. "Mom, I'm cold. When can we go home?" Richard turned his head. On a bench beneath a sagging street lamp sat a woman in a thin jacket, holding a little boy wrapped in an oversized scarf. The boy couldn't have been older than 5. His lips had a bluish tinge, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. The woman tightened her arms around him, whispering words meant to soothe. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. We'll find somewhere warm." Richard hesitated. He was not the sort of man who approached strangers in parks. But there was something in her voice. It wasn't the tone of a beggar, rehearsed or manipulative. It was the sound of someone desperately holding on to dignity while life stripped everything else away. "Excuse me," Richard said, his own voice startling him. "Are you all right?" The woman stiffened. Her grip on the boy tightened, her eyes flicking toward Richard with alarm before softening into wariness. "We're fine," she murmured, attempting a smile that barely reached her lips. "Just resting." Richard glanced at the boy again. His small shoulders shivered violently, his breath raspy in the cold. "Your son needs warmth," he said gently. For a moment, her composure cracked. Tears glimmered in her eyes, quickly brushed away with the frayed edge of a wool glove. We don't have anywhere to go, but we'll manage. These are just temporary difficulties." The boy coughed, a rough sound that made her flinch. She stroked his hair, then looked back at Richard as though forcing herself into formality. "My name is Emily Carter, and this is my son, Matthew." Richard nodded. "Richard Whitmore," he said, though the name meant nothing to her. For once, it didn't matter. Another cough shook Matthew's frame. Richard made his choice. "Listen," he said, his tone firmer now. "I live nearby. My house has more rooms than I could ever need. You and your son, you can stay there tonight. Get warm. Have a meal." Emily blinked, suspicion flashing across her face. You're inviting strangers into your home." "Never before," Richard admitted quietly. "But today isn't like any other day." His voice trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything he carried. "I don't have any hidden motives. I just can't leave you here." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Matthew's small voice cut through. "Mom, I'm hungry." Richard crouched down to the boy's level, ignoring the snow soaking into the knees of his slacks. "Do you like hot chocolate, Matthew?" he asked softly. The boy's eyes widened. He nodded. "And what about pie? Or maybe some warm rolls, straight out of the oven?" Matthew's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I like pie." That was enough. Emily's resistance faltered. She closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled shakily. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." Richard straightened, pulling his phone from his coat pocket. Within minutes, a black sedan pulled up to the park gates. Emily helped Matthew inside, still clutching the worn canvas bag that was all they had left. Richard followed, silent, his gaze fixed on the boy's small form nestled against his mother. As the car rolled through the iron gates of Whitmore Estate, past the guard who raised his brows in surprise, Richard realized how strange this must look. For 20 years, his house had been nothing but a mausoleum of marble and silence. Tonight, he was bringing life back into it. He did not know then that this decision, made on a snowy night when he was closest to death, was the very thing that would save him. The Whitmore estate had always been a place of order, polished surfaces, and silence, so heavy it felt like part of the architecture. When Emily Carter first stepped inside with her son, she froze in the marble foyer, her breath catching at the sight of the high ceilings and the chandelier that glittered like frozen stars. To her, it looked less like a home and more like a museum, grand, intimidating, and not meant for people like her. Matthew clung to her hand, his small fingers damp with sweat despite the cold. His eyes darted from the sweeping staircase to the portraits on the walls, wide with both awe and fear. "Mom," he whispered, "we don't belong here." Emily crouched, smoothing his hair. "Just for tonight, sweetheart. Just to get warm." Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded with unease. Richard watched them, the uneasiness in her posture not lost on him. For decades, his house had been a fortress of solitude, polished wood, cold marble, and endless echoing hallways. But now, seeing this woman in her worn jacket and the little boy clutching at her, he realized how lifeless it had been all along. He nodded to Mrs. O'Donnell, his housekeeper of 20 years, who stood frozen with surprise at the unusual sight. "Prepare the green guest room," Richard instructed softly. "It's the warmest." Mrs. O'Donnell hesitated, then quickly obeyed, her eyes flicking curiously toward Emily and Matthew. That evening, dinner was laid out in the kitchen rather than the cavernous dining hall. Richard suggested it himself, sensing the formality would suffocate them. Emily sat stiffly at the wooden table, Matthew perched beside her, still glancing around with uncertainty. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh rolls filled the air. Slowly, the boy reached for a roll, taking a bite so eagerly that Richard couldn't help but smile. It was the first genuine smile to cross his face since the diagnosis. As they ate, Richard asked nothing, waiting until Emily found her courage. Eventually, she set her fork down, her voice quiet but firm. "I should explain. You deserve that much." She told him of her past, the years working as a nurse, the small apartment she had scraped together, the moment Andrew Miller reappeared in her life. He had been Matthew's father, promising he had changed, begging for another chance. Against her better judgment, she had believed him. She sold her tiny apartment, signed over the money with the promise of a new start, and within weeks he disappeared. The landlord evicted her. She and Matthew had drifted between hostels and shelters until even that safety dissolved. Her voice didn't break. She told it with the calm exhaustion of someone who had carried the burden too long. But when she said, "Everything I had left he took," her eyes shimmered. She blinked hard and looked away, unwilling to cry in front of this stranger who had shown her kindness. Richard's chest tightened with something unfamiliar, not businesslike anger, not the cold fury he used to wield in boardrooms, but a raw indignation at injustice. He said nothing, only nodded gravely. But later, when Emily settled Matthew into the guest room, Richard retreated to his study. He picked up the phone and dialed his attorney. "I need information," he said. "Andrew Miller, former Pennsylvania resident. Track him down. And loop in corporate security. Discretion is essential." The man on the other end hesitated, then replied, "Understood, Mr. Whitmore." Richard hung up, staring at the darkened window. Snow still fell outside, but inside, for the first time in years, he felt purpose. In the days that followed, Emily remained cautious. She offered to cook, to clean, to make herself useful, though Richard insisted she didn't need to. Still, she moved quietly around the house, her presence subtle but undeniable. Matthew was the one who changed things most. His small footsteps pattered through the halls, his laughter echoed off the high ceilings, and with each sound, the mansion seemed less like a mausoleum and more like a home. One evening, as Richard walked past the library, he heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle. He peeked inside to see Matthew sitting on the rug, surrounded by toy cars Mrs. O'Donnell had unearthed from storage. The boy looked up, grinned shyly, and said, "Mr. Whitmore, want to see my racetrack?" The title, Mr. Whitmore, was formal, almost comical, coming from a 5-year-old. Yet it pierced Richard's heart in a way he hadn't expected. He crouched beside the boy, listening as Matthew explained the rules of his race. Something inside Richard cracked open. This child, who owed him nothing, was beginning to see him not as a stranger, but as someone to trust. That night, Richard retreated to his bedroom with a strange lightness in his chest. For months, headaches had hounded him, relentless reminders of the tumor growing inside his skull. He had relied on sleeping pills just to drift off for a few hours. But as he lay down, he noticed something remarkable. The pain, usually sharp and insistent, had dulled. His body, for once, wasn't fighting against him. Richard Whitmore closed his eyes, and without pills, without distraction, he drifted into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in years. He did not yet know it, but this was only the beginning. The Whitmore mansion no longer smelled of polish and cold stone. It smelled of cinnamon, butter, and something warmer than any oven could produce. In the mornings, Mrs. O'Donnell would shake her head with mock complaint as Emily moved easily around the kitchen, rolling dough or stirring soup. Emily insisted on helping, though her hands trembled the first time she reached for the flour jar. She wasn't a guest, she said quietly. She wanted to contribute. It reminded her of days long ago when she had cooked small meals in her cramped apartment for Matthew. Now, in this vast kitchen, she looked less like a guest and more like a daughter helping her family. Matthew's presence filled every corridor. The once echoing hallways now rang with his laughter, with the slap of his sneakers on the polished wood floors. Richard would sometimes pause at the landing above the grand staircase, listening to the boy's voice carry upward, like sunlight cutting through clouds. He had spent years surrounding himself with silence, mistaking it for peace. Now he realized how empty silence had been. On a gray afternoon, Richard returned from a business errand with bags of children's clothes. Emily blinked in surprise when she saw them, her hand stilling on the dish she was washing. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," Richard replied, setting the bags on the table. "But he deserves clothes that fit him, and he'll need supplies for school." Matthew emerged from the living room, curiosity lighting his face. When Richard handed him a small sweater, navy blue, soft wool, the boy pressed it against his cheek. His eyes shone, as if he could scarcely believe it was his to keep. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," he said solemnly. Richard swallowed hard. No boardroom victory, no acquisition, no accolade had ever touched him the way those simple words did. Emily adjusted quickly to her new rhythm in the house. She helped in the kitchen, folded laundry with Mrs. O'Donnell, and learned the quirks of the estate, the squeaky third stair, the draft that slipped under the back door, the way the furnace rattled when the snow piled too high. She never carried herself with entitlement. Instead, she moved with the quiet gratitude of someone who had known what it was to have nothing, and who didn't take comfort for granted. One evening, Richard came into the library to find Matthew sitting cross-legged on the rug with crayons scattered around him. The boy looked up and grinned shyly. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, holding up a paper covered with uneven shapes. "This is you? And this is Mom. And this is me. We're all together." Richard knelt, taking the drawing in his hands. The figures were crooked, the lines messy, but he stared at it as if it were a masterpiece. His throat tightened. "It's wonderful, Matthew." The boy tilted his head. "Can I be your friend?" The question was so earnest, so unguarded, that Richard felt something inside him crack. For years he had built walls higher than the gates of his estate, protecting himself from disappointment, from intimacy, from love. Now, with one innocent question, a 5-year-old had broken through. Tears stung Richard's eyes before he could stop them. He turned his face slightly, but Matthew still noticed. "Are you sad?" the boy asked softly. Richard shook his head, voice husky. "No, Matthew. I'm very glad." That night, Richard sat in his study long after the house grew quiet. He looked again at the crayon drawing, still resting on his desk. He thought about his own childhood, how quickly it had ended, how ambition had stolen the tenderness that should have been his to both give and receive. He thought of his mother, whose gentle hands he had left in the care of neighbors while he chased meetings. He thought of his father, whose funeral he had missed. For the first time, he didn't just regret. He wanted to change. The next morning, Richard called his attorney again. This time, his instructions were simple. Handle the paperwork for Emily Carter. She needs her documents restored. And start the process of enrolling her son in the best kindergarten Lancaster has to offer. When Emily heard, she protested. "That's too much. We can't accept." "You're not accepting charity," Richard interrupted. "You're accepting a chance. Every child deserves one." His tone left no room for argument. By January, catalogs for private schools began arriving at the estate. Richard flipped through them with uncharacteristic patience, pausing only to ask Matthew what colors he liked best, what kind of playground he wanted. The boy didn't understand the magnitude of the decisions being made for him, but his laughter as he circled pictures of swings and classrooms filled Richard with a sense of purpose stronger than any corporate merger. In the stillness of the evenings, as snow pressed against the windows and the fire snapped in the hearth, Richard realized something extraordinary. The pounding in his skull, the ache that had haunted him since the diagnosis, had dulled again. He sat in his leather chair, one hand resting on the drawing Matthew had given him, the other pressed to his temple. It wasn't gone. The tumor remained. But the pain was less, and for the first time, he believed that perhaps the doctors were wrong about how long he had left. Because for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore wasn't simply existing. He was beginning to live. The Whitmore mansion had never known the warmth of Christmas. For decades, Richard had treated December as just another month of fiscal reports and end-of-year board meetings. The tall fir trees that dotted Lancaster's neighborhoods, the lights strung across porches, the carols drifting from church choirs, those had belonged to other people's lives, not his, until now. That December, the house transformed. Emily insisted on baking cookies with Matthew in the kitchen, their laughter spilling down the corridors. Mrs. O'Donnell, at first skeptical, eventually joined in, dusting flour across the counter like a conspirator. Richard stood in the doorway, watching with something close to disbelief. The air smelled of sugar and nutmeg, not polish and wax. The sound of Matthew's high giggle clashed with the memory of decades of silence, and Richard felt as though the house itself had drawn a long breath after years of stillness. On Christmas Eve, Emily and Matthew dragged a tree through the door, helped, of course, by the driver who had carried it from the lot. It wasn't the most elegant tree Richard had ever seen. Its branches were uneven, the needles sparse in places. But Matthew clapped with delight as Emily strung popcorn garlands and tied handmade paper stars onto the limbs. "It's perfect," the boy declared, his eyes shining. Richard, standing beside the hearth, surprised himself by agreeing. That night, they ate dinner together at the smaller table in the conservatory. Snow dusted the glass panes, reflecting the soft glow of candles. Emily placed a wrapped box before him. Plain paper, tied with a string Matthew had insisted on knotting himself. Richard frowned. "What is this?" "A gift," Emily said simply. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a scarf hand-knitted, the stitches uneven but careful. Alongside it lay a small drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked house. "Me," Matthew explained, pointing, "and Mom. And you." Richard's vision blurred. In all his years of wealth, he had received gifts worth thousands: watches, cufflinks, rare bottles of wine. None had pierced him the way this simple scarf and drawing did. For the first time in decades, he heard words spoken without expectation, without calculation. Emily's voice was soft but steady. "Thank you, Richard, for giving us a home." He cleared his throat, but no sound came. His chest ached with a strange, almost unbearable gratitude. A few days later, Richard returned to Philadelphia for his scheduled checkup with Dr. Jonathan Lee. He expected the same grim expressions, the same hushed warnings. Instead, Dr. Lee stared at the scans on his monitor with open surprise. This is remarkable," the doctor murmured. "The tumor hasn't grown. In fact, it seems to have stabilized." Richard blinked. "Stabilized?" "Yes. With glioblastoma at this stage, we usually see rapid progression. But your scans show something different. It's not gone, of course, but it's holding. I've only seen this in a handful of cases." For a long moment, Richard sat in silence, absorbing the words. Stabilized. Not better, not cured, but not worse. A reprieve. A fragile thread of hope he hadn't dared to imagine. Driving back to Lancaster, he stared out at the snowy fields, his reflection in the window superimposed over the passing landscape. For the first time since the diagnosis, he didn't feel like a man counting down the days. He felt like someone given a second chance, however uncertain. That night, back at the estate, he found Matthew kneeling beside his bed, small hands pressed together. Emily hovered nearby, smiling gently but not interrupting. Richard lingered in the doorway unseen. "Please, God," Matthew whispered, his voice soft but earnest. "Don't let Mr. Whitmore be sick anymore. Make him better. He's nice. He makes pie with us. Please." Richard's breath caught. He pressed a hand to the doorframe, as if steadying himself against the weight of what he had heard. No shareholder, no board member, no employee had ever spoken of him with such unvarnished care. And yet here was a child, not bound by obligation, pleading for him in the quiet of a winter night. Later, when Matthew was tucked in and the house had grown still, Richard sat alone by the fire. He touched the scarf Emily had knitted, draped across the arm of his chair. His mind replayed the doctor's words, Matthew's prayer, Emily's soft thank you. For the first time since the tumor had stolen his certainty, Richard let himself believe. Perhaps he would not be granted years, perhaps only months more, but perhaps, just perhaps, he had longer than the doctors thought. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the room. Richard leaned back, closed his eyes, and allowed the fragile ember of hope to take root. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about profits or contracts. He was thinking about tomorrow, and it no longer felt like a burden. By early spring, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a house borrowed by strangers. It had become a home. Richard found himself lingering over breakfast with Emily and Matthew, setting aside the morning paper in favor of watching the boy dip toast into his cocoa. But the more precious those moments became, the more a single truth gnawed at him. Nothing was permanent. One evening, after Matthew had gone to bed, Richard sat across from Emily in the study. The fire burned low, casting shadows across the leather chairs. He cleared his throat, his voice heavy with something more personal than business. "Emily," he began, "I've been thinking about Matthew's future. About what happens if—" He paused, then forced himself to finish. "If I'm not here." Her face tensed. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. "Richard, you've already done so much. You've given us shelter, food, stability. I can't ask for more." "I'm not offering charity," Richard said gently. "I want to make it legal. I want to adopt him, to give him my name, my protection, and a trust fund, so he'll never have to worry about what you've both endured." Emily's breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her eyes darted to the floor, then back to his. "Adopt him?" Her voice trembled. "You mean make him yours?" "Yes." Richard leaned forward. "Yours and mine. Family. It wouldn't take anything from you, Emily. You'd always be his mother, but it would give him security. And it would give me," his words faltered, but he forced them out. "It would give me the chance to be something more than a dying man with an empty house." Silence filled the room. Emily's shoulders stiffened, and he could see the fear rise in her eyes. "What if I lose him? What if the court takes him from me once your name is involved? I've already lost everything once, Richard. I can't." Richard's voice sharpened, though not with anger. "No court will take him from you. I would never allow that. You've been his anchor, his only safe harbor. This is about protecting both of you, not replacing you." Emily searched his face, the tension in her frame slowly easing as she realized his sincerity. Tears welled and she whispered, "I want to believe that." "You can," Richard replied. "Trust me." The next weeks were consumed by paperwork and legal procedures. His attorneys prepared the trust fund documents, ensuring that Matthew would be financially secure for life. Meanwhile, Richard's private investigators uncovered what Emily had long suspected. Andrew Miller, the man who had abandoned them, was living in indulgence. Photos arrived, Andrew in expensive suits, a glass of champagne in hand, another woman at his side. The money he had stolen had bought him a new life, while Emily and Matthew had shivered on park benches. Richard's jaw tightened as he studied the evidence. The injustice was intolerable, but the law required Andrew's cooperation, however unwilling. To proceed with adoption, his parental rights had to be formally terminated. The confrontation was quiet but decisive. Andrew was brought to a discreet office in Philadelphia, where Richard's lawyer laid out the documents. Termination of parental rights. The man sneered, at first refusing, but Richard's calm authority left no room for defiance. "You abandoned your child," Richard said evenly. "You left him in poverty while you drank away stolen money. Sign these papers, and you'll never hear from us again. Refuse, and I will ensure the law strips you of more than rights. You'll lose the life you've built on theft." Andrew's arrogance faltered under the weight of Richard's gaze. Greed won out over pride. With a flourish of the pen, he signed. When Richard returned to the estate, Matthew was playing on the rug with his crayons. Emily looked up, anxiety etched across her features. Richard knelt beside the boy, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's official," he said softly. "From today forward, you're Matthew Whitmore." The boy blinked, not fully grasping the gravity of what had been done. Then a smile spread across his face. "Does that mean you're my grandpa?" The word pierced Richard's heart. He swallowed, his vision blurring as he nodded. "Yes, Matthew. Grandpa Richard." Matthew wrapped his small arms around him, and Richard let the tears fall. For years, he had measured success in profits and property, in mergers and contracts. Now, for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to leave a legacy. Not stocks, not buildings, but love carried forward in a child's voice. That night, as the house grew quiet, Richard lingered at Matthew's door, watching the boy sleep peacefully under the covers. Emily stood beside him, her hand lightly brushing his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard's chest ached, but not with despair. For the first time, he felt what it meant to belong. And as he turned away, he realized with astonishment that he no longer feared the end. Because he had finally found what he had searched for his whole life: a family and someone to carry his name into tomorrow. By the time spring unfurled into summer, life at the Whitmore estate had found a rhythm that no one had anticipated. The grand house, once a mausoleum of marble and silence, now pulsed with the cadence of ordinary days. Matthew toddled off to kindergarten in a crisp uniform Richard had insisted upon, his backpack almost too big for his small shoulders. Emily worked part-time as a nurse at a local clinic, her hours balanced, so she could still be home when her son returned each afternoon. For Richard, each of these changes carried a weight far beyond their simplicity. He found himself rearranging his schedule to attend Matthew's first day at school, sitting quietly at the back of the classroom as the boy introduced himself with shy confidence. He waited outside afterward, the Pennsylvania sun warming his face, and when Matthew ran into his arms with a smile, Richard felt richer than any boardroom triumph could make him. In the evenings, he read stories aloud, his voice hoarse but steady as Matthew curled under a blanket beside him. Emily sometimes joined, listening with a faint smile as if rediscovering the comfort of family life she had lost too soon. These moments stitched themselves into Richard's days, mending holes he had never admitted were there. But the tumor did not let him forget. The headaches returned, sharp and punishing. Some mornings, his hands trembled as he lifted his coffee. Fatigue wrapped itself around him like a heavy cloak. Emily noticed, of course. She set her hand on his arm one evening as he winced, her eyes full of quiet worry. "You need to see Dr. Lee again," she urged. Reluctantly, Richard agreed. A week later, he sat once more in the sterile office in Philadelphia, watching the doctor's eyes scan the latest MRI. "It's time we considered another approach," Dr. Lee said finally. "There's a procedure, gamma knife radiosurgery. It isn't an actual knife, but highly targeted beams of radiation. It won't cure glioblastoma, but it could shrink the tumor, slow progression, and give you more time." Richard absorbed the words, his hands clenched on the armrests. More time. That was what he wanted. Time to see Matthew grow. Time to see Emily's smile steady into security rather than worry. He nodded slowly. "What are the risks?" "Fatigue, headaches, swelling. And it isn't a guarantee. But if you're willing, we can schedule it within weeks." On the drive back to Lancaster, Richard stared out at the green fields flashing by, his decision already made. But before facing the sterile walls of a hospital again, he wanted to give something back to the family who had given him hope. "I want to take you both somewhere," he told Emily that evening, before the surgery, "a place with no white walls, no fear, just memories." Days later, the Whitmore car rolled onto the boardwalk of Atlantic City. The salty breeze carried the sound of gulls and the rhythmic crash of waves. Matthew pressed his face to the window, his eyes widening. "Is that the ocean?" "Yes," Richard said, unable to hide his smile. "That's the ocean." Matthew bolted toward the sand as soon as his shoes touched the ground, his laughter swallowed by the roar of surf. Emily hurried after him, her hair whipping in the wind. Richard followed more slowly, each step heavy but full of purpose. When he reached the shoreline, Matthew was already crouched, marveling at seashells, his hands sandy and wet. That weekend unfolded like a dream. They built lopsided sandcastles, ate sticky saltwater taffy, and walked the length of the boardwalk under neon lights. Emily laughed more in those 2 days than she had in months, and Richard found himself memorizing the sound. One night, after Matthew had fallen asleep to the lull of waves outside their hotel window, Richard and Emily stood on the balcony together. "You've given us more than I ever imagined," she said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Richard shook his head. "It's me who owes you. You and Matthew, you've given me life again." He paused, his voice breaking. "And I don't intend to let go of it easily." He turned to the horizon, where the dark sea met the starlit sky, and whispered the vow he had carried in silence until then. "I will live for them." The waves thundered as if to answer, and for the first time since his diagnosis, Richard felt not like a man counting down his days, but like one daring to claim them. The drive back from Atlantic City had been filled with silence, but it was not the silence of despair. It was the kind of silence that follows a promise, heavy with meaning. Richard carried that vow with him into the days that followed, his mind fixed on what lay ahead. Soon, the date for the procedure was set. Gamma knife radiosurgery, a name that sounded deceptively simple, almost harmless, but carried the weight of his future. On the morning of the operation, the car rolled through the streets of Philadelphia toward the hospital, the city wrapped in early autumn chill. Emily sat beside him, her hand steady on his arm, while Matthew clutched a drawing folded neatly in his pocket. Inside the sterile, bright corridors, the preparations began. Nurses adjusted machines, clipped sensors to his chest, murmured reassurances he barely heard. Dr. Jonathan Lee arrived, his face calm but his words precise. "It will take several hours. We'll target the tumor with beams of radiation. The risks are real, swelling, memory issues, fatigue. But there's a chance this buys you more time." Richard met his gaze and nodded. "Time is all I ask for." The procedure began. The frame was fixed around his head, a crown of steel and screws pressing against his skull. The hum of the machine filled the room as beams of concentrated energy pierced the darkness of his brain. He could not feel them, but he imagined them as blades of light fighting against the shadow that had claimed him. Emily sat in the waiting room with Matthew curled against her, the hours stretching endlessly. Every time the door opened, she looked up with hope, only to be told, "Not yet." She whispered prayers under her breath, Matthew clutching his folded paper so tightly it wrinkled. At last, Dr. Lee emerged. His expression was cautious but not grim. The procedure went as planned. It's too early to know the full outcome, but it was successful. Relief flooded Emily's face. She nodded, tears finally spilling. But the victory was only the beginning of another battle. The days that followed were grueling. Richard awoke disoriented, his speech slurred, words escaping him like birds too quick to catch. His legs refused to support him, and he had to be guided like a child. Frustration welled in him, sharp as the headaches that lingered. Emily never faltered. Morning to night, she was at his side. She coaxed him through simple exercises, lifting his arm, forming words, walking the length of the hall. When he stumbled, she steadied him. When he grew angry, she answered with quiet patience. Matthew contributed in his own way. Each day, he brought a new drawing. Stick figures on beaches, crooked houses, smiling suns. He taped them to the hospital wall until the sterile white was covered in bursts of color. One afternoon, Richard looked at the wall, at his gallery, and something inside him softened. He tried to say thank you, but the word tangled. Matthew only grinned and said, "It's okay, Grandpa Richard. You don't have to say it. I know." Weeks passed, each one chipping away at the mountain before him. Slowly his speech cleared. His steps grew steadier. The fog in his mind lifted in fragments, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Every victory was small, but each one felt monumental. One evening, Emily wheeled him to the hospital garden. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves burning orange and gold. She set a blanket across his lap, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," she said softly. Richard turned his head, meeting her gaze. His voice, though rough, carried conviction. "Not stronger. just not alone. He looked at Matthew, chasing leaves across the path, his laughter rising into the twilight. For decades, Richard had believed wealth was measured in towers of numbers in contracts and assets. But sitting there, with Emily beside him and Matthew's drawings still crumpled in his pocket, he understood what he had been blind to all his life. The true measure of fortune was not money. It was this: a child's trust, a woman's patience, a family's presence when you had nothing left to give. And for the first time, Richard Whitmore felt reborn. Years passed, each one a quiet victory against a fate doctors had once sealed for Richard Whitmore. What had been measured in months stretched into years, then nearly a decade. The tumor was never gone, but it had slowed, subdued into something he could live alongside rather than be consumed by. His steps were slower, his hair streaked with silver, but his eyes carried a light that had been absent before Emily and Matthew entered his life. The empire he had built, once driven by profit alone, began to shift. Richard no longer cared for quarterly gains or market expansion. Instead, he called meetings with his board and redirected vast resources into a foundation dedicated to helping orphans and children from broken homes. If we build skyscrapers, they will stand for decades, he told them. But if we build lives, they will stand for generations. His words silenced even the most hardened executives. Under his guidance, the Whitmore Foundation opened shelters, funded scholarships, and supported hospitals across Pennsylvania. Emily's journey mirrored his transformation. With Richard's encouragement, she returned to her studies, balancing coursework with motherhood. Nights once spent worrying about where she and Matthew would sleep were now spent at a desk, her textbooks spread out under the warm glow of a lamp. Years later, she graduated as a doctor of physical therapy, specializing in rehabilitation, the very kind of work that had helped Richard reclaim his strength. At her ceremony, when she walked across the stage to accept her diploma, she wore the name Emily Whitmore on her certificate. She had taken his surname not out of obligation, but to signify what they had become, a family united not by blood, but by choice and love. Matthew grew into a young man who carried both gentleness and determination in his stride. From the moment he watched Richard's slow, painful recovery, something had taken root in him. He admired the doctors who guided his grandfather through speech therapy, who celebrated each step regained as though it were a marathon. By the time he finished high school, his path was clear. He declared his intention to study medicine, to become a neurosurgeon. "I want to give other families what was given to us," he told Richard one evening, his voice steady with conviction. Richard listened, emotion tightening his throat. He reached out, clasping Matthew's hand. "Then you'll be carrying forward the miracle that saved me." And I couldn't be prouder. The years in their home were no longer filled with silence, but with the rhythm of a life shared. Emily checked in on patients and returned to sit at Richard's side in the evenings, recounting stories from her day. Matthew's textbooks piled high on the dining table, his late-night study sessions echoing the diligence Richard himself had once shown in boardrooms. The difference was clear. This diligence was for others, not himself. Richard's health, though never fully restored, remained steady enough for him to watch these milestones unfold. He attended Matthew's white coat ceremony in medical school, his hands trembling as he applauded, tears slipping freely. He smiled at Emily's professional successes, seeing her not as a guest he had once rescued, but as a daughter he had been given by grace. There were days when weakness overtook him. His body, aging and burdened by illness, sometimes failed him, but those days did not weigh as heavily as they once had. Emily was always there, steady and patient, and Matthew always came home with a smile or a story. On a quiet autumn evening, the three of them sat on the porch, the Pennsylvania hillsides blazing with orange and red. Matthew leaned against the railing, speaking excitedly about a case study from his classes. Emily sipped tea, her eyes full of quiet pride. Richard sat between them, wrapped in a blanket, his heart full. I used to believe my wealth was my empire, he said softly, looking at them both. Now I know better. My true legacy is here in this family. In you. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. And we're yours always. Richard's eyes lingered on Matthew, now a young man with a future as vast as the horizon. For decades, he had feared leaving nothing behind. But now he knew the truth. He had given, and been given, more than money could ever buy. He had found a daughter in Emily, a grandson in Matthew, and a life that, though fragile, was filled to its brim. Even as his strength waned, even as the tumor reminded him of his mortality, Richard Whitmore felt a peace he had never known. He was not alone. He was not forgotten. He was not unloved. And as twilight settled over the hills, he closed his eyes, smiling at the life he had built, not with contracts or fortunes, but with love that would outlast him. 15 years later, the Whitmore estate looked very different from the night Emily and Matthew had first crossed its threshold. The house was no longer a monument to silence. Its walls held photographs, its rooms echoed with voices, and its grounds bore the marks of children's footsteps and family gatherings. What had once been a mausoleum for wealth had become a sanctuary for love. Richard Whitmore, now in his late 60s, sat in a wheelchair by the wide bay window of the conservatory. His frame was thinner, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes remained clear, alive with pride. A plaid blanket covered his knees, and on the table beside him rested a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm. He didn't mind. His gaze was fixed on the figures in the garden. Matthew, no longer the shy boy with crayons, now carried himself with the confidence of a man who had fulfilled his calling. At 30, he was a practicing neurosurgeon, his white coat replaced here with a simple sweater, his laughter rising as he tossed a ball to his own young nephew. Nearby, Emily stood watching, her hair threaded with silver, her posture strong. She had built a career as a doctor of physical therapy, known for her compassion and relentless dedication. Patients traveled from across the state to see her, but at home, she remained what she had always been, the heart that held the family together. Richard watched them, his chest tightening not from illness but from wonder. He had lived to see this. He had lived far beyond the 8 months predicted by doctors, carried by will, by medicine, but most of all by the family who had given him a reason to fight. In the quiet moments, his mind often drifted back to that snowy night in Lancaster. The image was burned into him as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. The empty park bench, the fragile woman clutching her little boy, the snow swirling around them. He remembered the despair that had driven him out into the storm, convinced he had nothing left to live for. He remembered the decision to stop walking past, to open his door, to open his heart. That single act had rewritten all their lives. A soft knock pulled him back to the present. Emily entered, carrying a tray with fresh tea. She placed it beside him, then leaned down to kiss his cheek. "They'll be in soon," she said. "It's getting cold." Richard smiled. "Let them play. It's good to hear them." Moments later, Matthew appeared in the doorway, his hair ruffled from the wind. "Grandpa, it's starting to snow," he said, his voice warm, rich and steady. "Come see." With Emily's help, Richard maneuvered his chair toward the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray sky, settling over the garden and rooftops. Matthew's young nephew stretched out his hands to catch them, laughing in delight. Richard's heart swelled at the sight. Another generation, another chance for joy. They gathered together in the conservatory. 3 generations bound not by blood alone, but by choice, resilience, and love. Emily rested a hand on Richard's shoulder. Matthew stood tall beside him, his presence steady and strong. The room filled with warmth that no fire could provide, a warmth born of lives intertwined. Richard's voice, though faint, carried clarity. "All my life I thought wealth was measured in what I owned. The houses, the companies, the numbers in the bank. But sitting here, I know better. He looked from Emily to Matthew, his eyes glistening. True wealth is not measured in money, but in the lives we change with love. Silence followed, heavy with emotion. Emily's hand tightened on his shoulder, her eyes shining with tears. Matthew nodded slowly, his jaw set as though sealing a vow. Outside, the snow fell thicker, cloaking the garden in white. The scene mirrored the night that had begun it all, but this time the loneliness was gone. This time, Richard was not a man wandering toward death, but a grandfather surrounded by the legacy he had built. He leaned back in his chair, his breath slow but even, his lips curving into a gentle smile. Snowflakes drifted against the glass, the sound of laughter filling the air around him. For the first time, he did not fear the silence that would one day come, because he knew it would never truly be silence, not while Emily lived with his name, not while Matthew carried his spirit into every patient he healed, not while their love carried forward into the future. As the evening deepened and the snow blanketed the earth, Richard Whitmore sat surrounded by the family he had once never dreamed could exist. And in that moment, he felt the peace of a life complete. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, as 3 generations gathered close. And Richard, with a smile of quiet triumph, let the moment settle into eternity.